not increase our budget for electricity. And that's truly where you see the overspending in terms of that utility. We were really waiting until we had a solid baseline year. Part of the thing is during construction, we do end up paying for the electricity during the later phases of construction. But we were waiting until we could really get that good baseline, and we knew we could cover that with other categories. But you will see that overspending the budget in terms of utilities. And then the last category is materials and supplies, and we're projecting that we'll underspend just slightly there by about $27,000. So when you add all of those things together, the revenue and expenditures, you'll see on this chart that the very bottom line that we're projecting now is $832,725 being available. So when you compare that to the prior year, I'm going to switch to the chart on the next page. This is that chart that shows the 3 previous years, 19, 18, and 17. So what you'll see in FY19, for example, is at the end of the year, our revenue was $329,722 less than we budgeted, but at the same time, our expenditures were $346,976 less than we budgeted. So we had a net impact to our bottom line of $17,254. Right, so that was pretty different. That's incredibly tight in terms of that overall variance. When we look at the $832,000 that we're budgeting for this year, in terms of a variance percent, that's 1.6% available. Right, it always seems like it's a large dollar amount, but that really is a small percentage. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next budget question as well. So due to a requirement to operate within a balanced budget, school systems, state and local governments typically do end the year with an available balance to make sure that we meet all of our revenue and expenditure projections, but our goal is to continue to refine our budgeting and our projecting so we continue to get closer and closer, but we know that each year we are going to have some gap. So if it's okay, I'll transition into the next question that has to do with salaries and benefits, since they're really our biggest category.
So quickly, just if there are questions on the report that we've got before us right now, be happy to go ahead.
May I ask one question? I'm just curious about the grants, and if we don't get the grant, then we don't spend the money. But at what point do we know that? Have we been doing what the grant asked us all year long, and we just don't then get the money for it?
No, that's a perfectly good clarifying question. It's for unanticipated grants that we don't know are coming. It's not for anything that's been awarded. If we didn't have this budgeting mechanism in place, which is really typical in school systems or governments, if we didn't, we would have to wait until the next time we had a school board meeting to get the board to approve us increasing someone's expenditure, right? Because we can't use our contingency accounts without your approval. And we don't really have any other mechanism in terms of giving that expenditure authority to a school. So let's say somebody happens to get a $2,000 grant from Target. We would recognize that revenue in this grant revenue account, and then from that expenditure budget, we would allocate the $2,000 to the school to spend. So it's for no known grant, just the potential of a grant. Right, my assumption is it's been at that $300,000 level for a really long time.
And just for further clarification, it's not federal grants.
No.
Those are known grants that we get.
Correct. And federal grants, we would track separately in a federal category to report back on all of our documents to the federal government.
Thank you, Ms. Michael. This is very helpful. A question about the chart on page 5. So the last line that you just went through, the revenue less expenditures for the historical years, I want to test my understanding of what that reflects. If we had money in a contingency fund, which we do every year, and we didn't spend it, that would be positive amounts included in those numbers, correct? So if we had $300,000 and we didn't spend it, that would be included in the revenue less expenditures, say, for 2018.
So when you look at it in the revenue number, because it was revenue that we didn't receive, it would be a negative number in the revenue.
So this is a contingency fund, not use of fund balance.
So we've included all of that contingency funding both in the revenue categories and the expenditure categories in this chart.
Okay.
They're rolled together, so they will, on this chart, they happen to be rolled into all other expenditures. So in FY nineteen, they're part of that negative 286,000. So if you remember in FY nineteen, right, we did have that significant expenditure replacing the floor at Maryland Henderson, for example. Right, so in that case, all other expenditures, which included the contingency funding as well as all the logistics funding, was higher than what we had budgeted.
Okay, so
So yes.
So I still don't understand the question. Let's say we have a fund, we have a contingency fund of $300,000. We don't spend it at the end of the year. Is that net neutral on the revenue less expenditures line, or is that a positive $300,000 on the revenue line?
It's net neutral because it would, the revenue portion and the expenditure portion would knock each other out, so there would be no impact on the bottom line. We would have no revenue, we would have no expenditures, and they would wipe each other out.
Can I clarify?
Yeah.
Maybe just between us here. So making sure I understand. So if we have a $300,000 revenue sitting, where does that sit? That sits in the all other expenditures category, correct? The contingency fund.
Yes, but there would be contingency revenue in the revenue, and there would be contingency expenditures in the expenditures.
Okay. But if it was carryover from the year before, it would still show up as a revenue as a carryover.
Correct.
Okay.
So I'm afraid I just plain don't get it, and I apologize. I'm going to have to. So I get it for if you were talking about use of fund balance, right? So that you record, say this year or the current fiscal year, it's $450K, and if we don't spend it, that's $450K that we're pulling in that's not in the transfer. That's sort of other revenue, and if we don't spend that, then the revenue goes down and the expenditures go down too, and so it's net neutral. And the fund balance just stays the same.
Correct.
But that the contingency funds, to the best of my recollection, are drawn out and budgeted each year from other revenue sources, including the city transfer. So I get how we would not spend the money if we didn't have the expenditure. But it seems to me like unless the contingency is part and parcel and already captured in the use of fund transfer, we're still getting the revenue from one of multiple sources. So it feels to me, I mean, listen, I'm not an accountant, right? But in an accounting sense, like there would be a reduction in expenditure, but not a reduction in revenue if we didn't spend contingency fund drawn, for example, from the city transfer.
So, with the exception of that other grant revenue that has a revenue budget and an expenditure budget tied to it, right? So those have both. When you look at the other contingency funding that we have, it's very similar in amount to what our budgeted beginning balance is. So for example, if we eliminated our contingency for catastrophes, if we eliminated that as well as our salary increase contingency, right, those amounts plus our staffing reserve are very close to what our budgeted beginning balance are in terms of overall. Does that help?
I'm afraid not. What I don't get, and I'm happy to have this conversation rather than take everyone else's time up, but I don't get how contingency is budgeted as revenue unless we're actually doing the budgeting. So, we could make what I take from what you're saying is we could make our contingency $10 million, and it doesn't matter because that's going to balance out. In other words, we're not spending money, we're not putting money in the contingency fund that we've got. It's all contingent. And I always thought of contingency funds as sort of, the rainy day fund where we've got the money coming in, but we're not spending it yet, and we'll identify how to spend it later. So I'll just drop that one for now and deal with the questions on question one.
Sure, and let me try one other thing. You're absolutely right in terms of those contingency budgets on the expenditure side are there for a rainy day, if we need to expend them. Right here, they're historically very close in amount to that budgeted beginning balance. Right, and you could look at it as a coincidence or a planned activity that somebody had previously done, assuming, right, if we use our contingency budget on the expenditure side, right, in terms of where that funding's coming from, it could be coming from that budgeted beginning balance. Right,
Okay.
typically you wouldn't want to use a budgeted beginning balance to pay for recurring expenditures, because that's just one-time funding. So my assumption is that my predecessor, in terms of budgeting for that beginning balance, was thinking that would offset those budgets for contingency expenditures. So in the event that you use the expenditure budget, it's really being covered by that one-time beginning balance source, not from a transfer from the general government. That's my assumption.
Okay,
Still not helping?
No.
Okay.
No, that explanation makes perfect sense for use of fund balance for me, but I think of contingency as a different category. And if it isn't, then that's useful to know, and that makes sense to me. But since it is a budgeted category as opposed to, then not spending the contingency means we have to have a higher cap, well, we'll deal with it later.
Okay. So let me talk a little bit about our first budget question in terms of salary lapse. I think I'm gonna get there, sorry for the scrolling. Or do you need to switch to another document for the budget questions?
Oh. Before we do that, Ms.
Sure.
Michael, quickly, just making sure that, are there any other pressing questions on this report? Otherwise, we'll go ahead to the next item on the agenda, which is the budget questions, Q&A. Okay.
And I'll just add one more piece, and that is that we have been discussing internally about doing some two of you at a time. So if you want to come in and ask us questions, so Mr. Reitinger, that would be a perfect opportunity to sort of go deeper into that question to make sure you understand, and then perhaps if we can get to a place where it's more understandable for you, perhaps it would be more understandable to the public too, because we want to make sure we get everybody's knowledge base up. So anyway, we'll be reaching out for those of you that wish to come in and have one-on-one meeting or two-on-one meetings with us. We'd be happy to do that.
Okay, Ms. Michael, go ahead with the next one, then. Thanks. So we're moving on to 3.03, the budget questions Q&A.
Yes, so this question has to do with the additional $60,000 that we've budgeted for additional salary lapse, which is savings from turnover and vacancy. So as positions turn over, positions are vacant. And then it further talked about how do we calculate that and how do we calculate our salaries. And you are correct, we have historically underspent our salaries and benefits. So we'd really like to walk through all of that. And then this question also talks about the forecasted end-of-year balance that was in our monthly monitoring report. So we thought it'd be helpful to do these two things kind of together. All right. So this budget question has the chart that we just looked at from the previous monthly monitoring report in terms of what was our available balance for each of the 3 fiscal years that were complete, 19, 18, and 17. So when you look, just as I had indicated, we have historically underspent in salaries and benefits, and just as a reminder, they do comprise the majority of our budget at over 86%. So when we look at these 3 previous years in terms of using them for historical data, in 2017, there were budget transfers processed that moved money across categories. And that's something that we did not do in FY 18 and 19, as we were really trying to establish a base. So when you look at that, I use that as a kind of a point of reference as we're looking across these categories, just making sure we have that understanding as we compare these. So looking across all of those categories, you can see, for example, on the bottom of this chart, and I apologize, it's really small. In FY 19, we underspent salaries by basically $365,000 and benefits by $269,000. That was compared to in FY 18, we underspent by $871,000 in terms of salaries and $237,000 in terms of benefits. And then again, as I noted, in FY17, those amounts were lower, but at that point in time, multiple budget transfers were processed that moved money. So I caution us on using that in terms of a comparison. So when we think about how we're working to improve